culture, resistance, and dialogue. The idea of ethnography as a kind of conversation is now common in anthropology, as common as the idea of ethnography as a kind of natural science once was. Some people misinterpret the presence of ethnographers in their texts as a form of narcissism, and condemn what they see as the navel-gazing quality of current ethnographic narrative. Those critics will not be happy with this effort. But I see the reflexivity of contemporary ethnography as an honesty about the limitations of our vision, that has too long been suppressed in the interests of creating a false aura of authority about our work. Relinquishing that authority is not easy, and it is particularly not easy to share authority with one's interlocutors, without denying one's own ultimate responsibility for a text. Dialogical ethnography with a community in struggle is even more fraught with difficulties, moral, methodological, and literary, than usual. Extraordinary circumstances create extraordinary demands for anthropology. Who knows whether I did it right, in a way that is enlightening rather than mystifying, in a way that will help rather than hurt, or, at least, in a way that will do minimum harm to those on whose welcome this work was predicated. With other scholars, and perhaps particularly with other women scholars, I believe we have to reflect carefully on these matters, too long neglected in the name of academic freedom and scientific hegemony. While I cogitated on these questions toward the end of 1994, as transcriptions of interviews with Sikh militants were proceeding apace, a debate broke out among the Sikh community with regard to a new book on Sikhism, by Harjot Oberoi, holder of a chair in Sikh and Punjabi Studies, at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. I watched this interaction with great interest, and I found myself weighing my own relationships with Sikhs against those of Oberoi, and discussing both with them. The dialogue between myself and the Sikhs intersected with the dialogue between myself and other scholars at this critical point, expressed in the publication of an academic volume that excited vehement argument in the community under study. I therefore go into this juncture in some detail, as a means of bringing together the complex point at which author, subjects, and academic audience are joined in somewhat dissonant conversation. Since it is into this nexus that the present book will be inserted, it seems necessary to flesh out this context in order to convey to the reader the fuller meaning of this book, whose political and academic context makes it more than the words typed on these pages, and the meanings construed from them by individual readers. Weapons at the door. One of my first encounters with militant Sikhs was at San Pedro prison. At the main gates of the prison, I, Amarjit, and the other Sikh were asked to remove all metal objects from our persons, including the swords of the two Sikhs. They were loath to part with their swords, and Amarjit indeed had tears in his eyes, as the guard explained to us that even the tiny 1-inch version of the kirpan, often used in emergencies such as this one, was not allowed. In the end, we had to put all our things, my jewelry, their swords, by a pole at the gate. The guard did not want to even claim responsibility for their safekeeping, while we visited the prison. Thus denuded, we went in to interview Sikh prisoners. I came to see this initial encounter as a metaphor for much of what passes for dialogue in contemporary ethnography, which I have attempted to move beyond in this volume. In his address to the American Anthropological Association in 1987, Edward Said pointed to the salon-like quality of many current conceptions of anthropology's interlocution with its subjects, possibly stemming from the roots of these conceptions in literary criticism. Quote, "The interlocutor is someone who has perhaps been found clamoring on the doorstep, where from outside a discipline or field, he or she has made so unseemly a disturbance, as to be let in, guns or stones checked in with the porter, for further discussion," he writes. The gentle civility implied by this image of the exchange of ideas, across divides of culture and power, is as artificial and misleading, as the non-dialogic scientism of another anthropology, now criticized vehemently. In the messy, sometimes bloody real world, the swords on the hips of contemporary interlocutors won't be taken off for anthropologists who lack the bureaucratic power of the U.S. prison system. The scrubbed disinfected interlocutor, Said continues, is a laboratory creation with suppressed, and therefore falsified, connections to the urgent situation of crisis and conflict, that brought him or her to attention in the first place. We can't learn much of importance from desorted Sikhs, a contradiction in terms for the orthodox, we therefore have to find a way to talk to them with weapons on. This weapons at the door image, concretized for me at San Pedro prison, was in my mind as I pursued a dialogue with Sikhs in struggle. Harjot Oberoi has written a book on Sikh identity, that has prompted nothing short of an uproar among the orthodox. Originally published in India, The Construction of Religious Boundaries, had already established itself as an important resource for scholars, and a bone of serious contention for Sikhs, by the time of its North American publication in 1994. The North American Sikh community quickly generated an entire volume of critical response called, The Invasion of Religious Boundaries. Because Oberoi became controversial, I, as a fellow traveler, a member of the same academic tribe, found myself newly challenged by my interlocutors as well. Why should we bother with you, when you might write something like The Construction of Religious Boundaries? Facing these questions, it became critical to me, to find out what it was about Oberoi's work, that prompted such vehemence. The theme of Oberoi's volume, indicated by the subtitle, Culture, Identity and Diversity in the Sikh Tradition, is the historical pluralism of the Sikh tradition, and the amorphous boundaries between Sikhs and non-Sikhs, up until the early 1900s, at which point his study ends. The diffuse identities subsumed under the general heading Sikh, have been, as Oberoi notes, an area of silence in much religious scholarship, since these various identities do not mesh with the contemporary formulation of Orthodox Sikhism, as described in this volume. What you read in Chapter 2, is a hagiographic, not a strictly academic reading of Sikh history. By contrast, Oberoi follows W. H. MacLeod, in tracing the gradual evolution of contemporary Sikh identity, calling into question contemporary Sikh claims to the separateness of Sikh tradition, and the historical persistence of an identifiable Sikh community. In its challenge to received notions of Sikh identity, Oberoi's book is recognizable as an example of the current deconstructive genre in academia, unpacking invented traditions and imagined communities, to reveal a much more fluid picture of social life. With similar efforts in other religious and ethnic forums, however, Oberoi's work brings forth insistent political questions, that I believe cannot be neglected. Our interlocutors, in any case, won't let us neglect them. Oberoi begins his study, with what has become a commonplace questioning of the usefulness of religious categories in reference to India, starting with the diffuse quality of the Hindu tradition, and the recency of the label Hindu, and moving on to propose a parallel vagueness in the category Sikh. Although it is clear, that the idea of uniform textual communities, is utterly inapplicable to the Indian situation, as Oberoi and others note, the level of conflict among religious groups both historically and presently, suggests some measure of indigenous categorical identification. From Wittgenstein, we know that not all members of a category, must share a fixed set of features for the category to be cognitively viable, a fact apparently lost on academicians who, failing to find a set of shared attributes, announce the non-existence of community. For Oberoi, however, the disestablishment of classically conceived religious categories, provides the backdrop to his chronological examination of Sikh identity, from the inception of the tradition in the 15th century, through the Singh Sabha reforms of the 19th. It is only then, according to Oberoi, that we can speak of the Sikhs as something like a demarcated community. This notion is not really new, but Oberoi fleshes out this thesis better than anyone else has done, and the book won a prestigious award from the American Academy of Religion as a result. The central role of the 10 gurus in Sikhism is downplayed by Oberoi, fascinated as he is more by boundary phenomena, by the fuzzy edges of the Sikh arena, than by its center. He treats the biographical accounts of Guru Nanak, for example, as wonder stories, emphasizing the constructed quality of notions about this founding figure of Sikhism, as well as the syncretic quality of the Sikh holy book, The Adi Granth. Here we have an obviously important disjunction between Oberoi's view, and that of Orthodox Sikhism, where he sees the Catholicity of stories about the first Guru, and the diversity of contributions to the Adi Granth, as indicators of the lack of a separate or definable identity on the part of the Sikhs. They treat these as measures of the spiritual universalism of their tradition. The radically different morality espoused by Guru Nanak and his successors, e.g., the rejection of caste, is de-emphasized by Oberoi, who follows mainstream Hindu thought, in considering the Sikhs themselves as one branch of a broader Hindu, or Indian social and spiritual world, with caste affiliation as a crucial component of that world. He writes of Hinduism as a large inn, with the Sikhs as one wing, and describes the moral code later articulated by the Khalsa or Orthodox Sikhs, the Rahit, as of the same status as the Dharmas, of various other caste groups in Indian society. The question of just how heterodox traditions fit into, alongside of, or against the overarching Hindu framework in India, goes beyond the case of the Sikhs alone, of course, as noted in Chapter 5 of this book. Buddhists and Jains, classed with Sikhs as part of the Hindu community for some purposes, e.g., in the controversial Article 25 of the Indian Constitution, are also focal points of issues of category definition on the subcontinent. In fact, Oberoi's comment at the end of his book, the Guru's only intention in initiating Sikh tradition, was to remove the social and moral evils which had seeped into the fabric of Hindu society, is a near paraphrase of former President Radhakrishnan's formulation, of the Buddha as Hindu reformer, now as axiomatic to Hindus, as it is abhorred by Buddhists. The congruence between Oberoi's vision and that of Brahminic Hinduism, is inescapable for non-Hindu readers, though unremarked by the author. This subtext of the book is not immediately apparent to the non-specialist audience, which may not be aware of the extent to which mainstream Western scholarship on India follows traditionally Brahminic conceptions of the Indian social order. But these congruities, being linked literally to life or death questions in India today, leap out persistently for the politically situated Sikh reader. Continuing this tradition, Oberoi sets up a dichotomy between what he calls Sanatana Sikhs and Khalsa or Orthodox Sikhs, proposing that the pluralistic eclecticism of the wider Sikh community, including continuing attention to caste, celebration of Hindu festivals, veneration of pairs, and so on, was simply a way of life in rural Punjab seen as Sanatana, or from time immemorial. Oberoi draws on Foucault to discuss the ways in which the Sanatana episteme was gradually overshadowed by the Khalsa episteme, that rejected the poetic, ludic, magical qualities of Sanatana Sikhism, in favor of a more linearly defined, and ethically Puritan scriptural orthodoxy. Culminating in the Singh Sabha reforms that formed the foundation of contemporary Sikhism, the Khalsa episteme focuses, Oberoi says, on the three Gs. Guru, Granth, and Gurudwara, and can most effectively be seen as the movement of an indigenous elite, to appropriate the wider tradition in its own interests. That this appropriation led to the current situation of polarization between the Khalsa-dominated Sikh tradition, and the Hindu community it perceives as both alien and repressive, is the political message left hanging in the air, as the book concludes well before the current Sikh-Hindu tensions. Although the construction of religious boundaries is an objectivist rendering of Sikh history, without an explicit political message, the way Sikh history is construed here, effectively subverts any understanding of Sikh militancy, in terms other than fanaticism. The fact of conflict, which has spawned the resistive posture of the Khalsa Sikh, is entirely absent from his book. There is barely a mention in the book of Afghan wars, Mughal domination, the persecution of Sikhs and Hindus both, and the eventual Hindu nationalism, that molded the anti-colonial movement and the current state of India. Without the context of this endemic conflict, the formation of the militant ethos that largely defines the Khalsa episteme, is left opaque. We first hear of Sikh martyrs, for example, in the discussion of the distribution of tales about them, by Singh Sabha activists in the 19th century, so that one is left with more of an impression of the propagandistic telling of the stories of martyrs, than with the fact of historical martyrdom itself. It is clear that history gets rewritten, accounts are embellished, put to particular uses, and so on. But to leave out the actual fact of persecution and execution of Sikhs, is itself a rewriting with important repercussions. Likewise, the missionary aspects of Arya Samaj activities, which played a significant role in prompting calls for orthodoxy among the Sikhs, is ignored, giving a lopsided picture of why Sikh sentiment coalesced around a relatively uniform understanding of Sikh identity. The consolidation of the Sikh community, expressed through and since the Singh Sabha movement, is both a matter of fundamentalism and of resistance, and the way in which these axes intersect, is of critical interest. Without attention to intergroup conflict, one perceives the solidification of collective identity, solely as the result of the first part of this equation. Community boundaries are thereby effectively depoliticized, and for secular Western readers, undermined. For those interested in demonstrating the separateness of the Sikh nation, and in justifying the struggle to achieve a Sikh homeland today, Oberoi's book is highly problematic. And indeed the response provoked by the construction of religious boundaries in the Orthodox Sikh community, has been dramatic. Not only are Sikh critics of Oberoi upset by this aggressive work of mischievous propaganda, as one contributor to the new volume of criticism calls it, but they are taking action to try to unseat Oberoi from the academic chair he holds at UBC, which is partially funded by contributions from the Sikh community. They have held meetings at various locations in North America and Punjab to discuss the situation, as well as bringing the Akal Takht into the fray. Oberoi himself has addressed criticisms from the Orthodox circle, but eventually found it unamenable to dialogue. Indeed, the angry calls launched by the most strident, amount to attempts at censorship, and verge on the personally threatening. This is not the first time a dispute has occurred between Orthodox Sikhs and scholars of the Western tradition. Just before the controversy over the construction of religious boundaries, there was a great debate about a PhD dissertation at the University of Toronto, by Pashora Singh, a student of Hugh MacLeod's, who was eventually given a penance to perform by the Akal Takht, including cleaning the shoes of Sikh pilgrims. MacLeod has in fact become an epithet of choice among Orthodox Sikh academics, who reject what they see as the disrespect for Sikh belief, from the Western scholarly community. Ernest Trump, a Western scholar of Sikhism of the 19th century, is said to have smoked cigarettes, anathema to Sikhism, while studying the Holy Book. Whether true or not, this image is stamped in Orthodox Sikh minds, as characteristic of the Western attitude toward religion, one devoid of respect for the sensitivities of the faithful. The conversation about Harjot Oberoi, his new book, and his chair in Sikh studies, is going on as I write this, so the outcome is not yet clear. While the debate clearly brings out the dangerously intolerant quality of Orthodox Sikhs, whose ire has been roused, it can also provide an important window into two aspects of current scholarship, that I would like to problematize here. First, is the trend toward the deconstruction of group identities, which Oberoi celebrates in this volume, a phenomenon as repellent to people conceiving themselves as members of the challenged groups, as it is attractive to postmodern academics. Second, is the unwillingness of many academics to engage in dialogue with people who refuse to play the conversation game our way, whose behavior is, as Said says, unseemly, who decline to converse if it means taking off their swords. Because many of those involved in the assertion of political identities today, in fact have swords on, so to speak, i.e., are in the middle of struggle, these two are intertwined. By not talking to Sikh fundamentalists, many scholars of religion fail to grasp the sensitivity to talk of ambiguous identities, that prompts negative reactions to works of scholarship like the construction of religious boundaries. With appropriate care, I believe that the impasse between Harjot Oberoi, a rigorous and innovative scholar, and the Orthodox Sikhs, devout and embattled believers, could have been avoided. Identities imposed and denied. A common theme in current Indological scholarship is the impact of British colonialism on communal identities, typically conceived as quite fluid before the divide and rule strategies of the imperial power, solidified them into the more definable units we witness today. Though this formulation neglects the very real conflicts between religious communities that took place long before the British arrived on the scene with their categorization schemes, it is clear that the colonial differentiation of groups on the subcontinent into martial races, criminal tribes, and so on, had an important impact on the development of contemporary communal divisions, particularly with regard to groups like the Sikhs, who benefited from British patronage, insofar as they retained the symbols of their separateness. We know that the same sort of thing happened in other colonial areas. Tribal divisions in Africa were artificially reified, and anthropologists are now accused of complicity in this, with their overdetermined formulations of the newer, the tiv, the this and that, characteristic of traditional ethnography. Now that the age of colonization is over, the explicit kind at least, anthropology is trying to disengage itself from this heritage by, among other things, rejecting the essentialism of classic conceptualizations of cultures, as definable entities. We are currently interested in flux, ambiguity, the polyphony, or cacophony of multiple voices that speak, or shout across, between, and within traditional boundaries. Oberoi's perspective on Sikhs as goddess worshippers, venerators of Muslim pairs, and caste-based social actors, is of this genre, and will therefore certainly be applauded by those up to date on postmodern ethnography. So why does this vision anger many Sikhs? Why does Richard Handler's vision of Québécois culture, so challenging theoretically, and so important substantively, anger many Québécois? One could name countless similar examples. The answer often given is that these perspectives undercut the ideological formulations of indigenous elites, whose own power base depends on the acceptance of invented traditions and imagined communities as wholly real. Thus Oberoi talks about resistance to orthodox elites in Sikhism, making the orthodoxy as resistance narrative of Sikh history appear to be propaganda. The subversion of this narrative, as in the construction of religious boundaries, can then be seen as actually liberatory. But, predicated as it is on a consideration of Sikhism, utterly independent of the domination/subordination dynamic, vis-a-vis other communities, this model is a charade. Orthodox elites succeeded in redefining Sikhism, because people saw them as taking the lead in resistance, to first Muslims, then Hindus, just as Québécois nationalist elites succeed, insofar as they do, because of Quebec's historical relationship of subordination to Anglophone Canada. If one looks just at Sikh, or Québécois tradition, this success is enigmatic. It's the broader political context that makes it understandable, in terms other than the acquiescence of the masses to fanaticism. Richard Handler, who has been most forthright in explicitly grappling with these issues, says bluntly that ethnography should be destructive of group myths, that one should be careful not to echo the ideologies of the people one studies, even to reject calling them what they want to be called, for example, the Québécois, as an act of complicity in myth-making. This metaphor is echoed ironically, in the title of the Man, Sadi, and Gill volume responding to Oberoi, which was originally titled, The Destruction of Religious Boundaries. The title was changed when the editors realized it might be taken to imply that Sikh identity could indeed be destroyed. These critics, in any case, probably do not imagine that there are academics, who might take pride in destruction, as indicative of acute ethnographic acumen. The two valuations of destructive/destruction here, show the semantic gulf that divides the worlds of academia and politics. Is there any way to talk with people who reject destruction, without giving up the usefully skeptical attitude of contemporary ethnography, to stand up for the human rights of suppressed groups, without going along with the myths they have created? Can we talk about making culture without making enemies? The problem here is that the artificial reification of groups that scholars like Handler and Oberoi appropriately react against, is both a theoretical and a political matter. When the people whose group identities we deconstruct, are using those identities as leverage points against domination by others, experiencing a collective identity with swords on, so to speak. Academic discussion of the historical constructedness of categories, not only seems absurdly abstract, but can be taken as the outright sabotage of assertions of group rights. Hence the tension between Harjot Oberoi and separatist Sikhs. What he writes as an avowedly non-political, ethno-historical tract, is taken by the sordid as mischievous propaganda. There is undeniably paranoia here, but there is also something we can learn from. Part of the current popularity of the deconstruction of group identities in anthropology resulted from a belated recognition of the discipline's partnership with the colonial enterprise, which used imposed identities to control and ultimately exclude others. The ignored fact in most discussions of the reification of group identities by the powerful, however, is that such reification is only one way in which power can be maintained. Aware as we now are of the impact of European colonial domination on the world, and on our discipline, and evident as it has become, that the superordinate definition of groups was a key part of this domination, we now emphasize it to the neglect of strategies of domination, on the part of liberal democracies and post-colonial states today, that involve not the imposition, but the denial, of group identities. It is no longer acceptable in the international forum, to label people as belonging to alien groups, and then to ghettoize them, or cleanse them. Witness the global condemnation of apartheid South Africa, or Serbian expansion. These are easy targets for liberal sentiment, as white South Africans and Serbs assert their power, in the way of colonial or totalitarian states. They are reminiscent of fascism. In their labeling of people as other, they hint of concentration camps and gas chambers. But the more insidious kind of domination, far more common in the world today, is the kind that exalts the individual, and claims the equality of individuals before the state, while in fact replicating a status quo in which a majority community holds continuing power over minority communities. In a one-person, one-vote situation, minorities will generally lose, and, recognizing this, assert themselves as a group. This kind of resistive identity is different from the subservient identities imposed by imperial powers, or from the hegemonic identities claimed by expansionist communities like the Nazis, a fact that eludes many theorists of group identity today, who see in every assertion of collectivity a potential pogrom, e.g., Arthur Schlesinger's popular tract, warning against the excesses of multiculturalism, the disuniting of America. In post-colonial India, this trend is particularly dangerous, as it mirrors traditional forms of hegemony, that refuse to acknowledge difference of Buddhists, of Jains, of Sikhs, viewed simply as another form of Hindu. The domination of a Brahminic Hindu center throughout Indian history, is replicated today in the Hindu resurgence, which claims that being Hindu means simply being Indian, a stance which sounds like an aspect of tolerance, but is taken by non-Hindus as exclusionary, since it equates assertions of the separateness of their religious traditions with treason. That the secular intelligentsia of India has largely gone along with the formulation, that it is the intransigence of the minority communities, and not the appropriation of Indian identity by the majority community that is the problem here, reflects the same liberalism that sees black nationalism, not white racism, as the problem in the United States. The congruence of postmodern ethnography, with the kind of power that asserts itself not by imposing but by denying group identities, and the subtle convergence of Western intellectual tradition, with the rhetoric of the liberal state including India, is obvious to those outside our paradigms, or resisting our states. As Talal Asad points out, it is a notorious tactic of political power, to deny a distinct unity to populations it seeks to govern, to treat them as contingent and indeterminate. It is precisely the viewpoint of interventionist power, that insists on the permeability of social groups, and unboundedness of cultural unities, and the instability of individual selves. This was not true of the colonial state, but it is an appropriate insight into the functioning of the liberal state. In a United States that upholds a melting pot rhetoric, while continuing to keep its African origin ingredients subordinate, and condemning black nationalists as chauvinists, the confluence of an academic milieu, bent on destroying group identity, with the perpetuation of a status quo based on denial of group identities, is clear. The denial of a Kurdish identity in Turkey, where they used to be called just Mountain Turks, the denial of a Pakhtunistan in Pakistan, where it is still called just the Northwest Frontier, and the denial of a Sikh religion in India, where it is called just a wing in a large Hindu inn, are equally prominent examples of the kind of power that claims egalitarian individualism, but supports continued status differences among groups. As Edward Said notes, the implicit consent of intellectuals to the colonial project played a key role in its success. In anthropology, this took the form of the celebration of imposed group identities, through classic ethnography, which we rightly criticize today. But now the terms of power have changed. In the post-colonial state, the destruction of group identities is not a progressive but a regressive act, and it is the exploration of denied group identities that is the most politically challenging avenue of contemporary research. This kind of exploration does not sit comfortably in the current academic literature on ethnic and religious identities, particularly when the identities in question seem to be leading in the direction of national sovereignty, e.g. Sikhs, Québécois. One line of argument suggests that nationalism is itself a Western idea, only secondarily imitated by others, and Handler intimates the same, in arguing that the idea of having a nation of one's own is an aspect of possessive individualism. Ernest Gellner and Eric Hobsbawm, more famously, view nationalism as an essentially outmoded philosophy in an increasingly interconnected world. These ways of thinking sound progressive in the circles of Western intelligentsia, but carry a very different message for people who have developed nationalist aspirations today, as a means of acquiring the recognition they are denied in the liberal states in which they find themselves. Said observes that there is a marked discomfort with non-Western societies acquiring national independence, which is believed to be foreign to their ethos. Hence the repeated insistence on the Western provenance of nationalist philosophies, that are therefore ill-suited to, and likely to be abused by, Arabs, Zulus, Indonesians, Irish, or Jamaicans. Carol Breckenridge, and Peter van der Veer, in an important book on the predicament faced by post-colonial academics, note that, by deconstructing the categories, we certainly do not dissolve the political realities. The deconstruction of secularism, nationalism, and communalism cannot be separated from an arena in which the nature of the post-colonial state is the subject of violent confrontations. The fact that Orthodox Sikhs now feel wholly alienated from Harjot Oberoi is symptomatic then of the different trajectories being followed by Western academia, especially contemporary ethnography, and minority communities around the world. The rebirth of ethnicity, the revival of religion, and the wildfire spread of separatist movements, are all phenomena which, as they draw our attention in theoretical terms, pull us away from our so-called interlocutors, in political terms. But what shall we do about this widening gap? Is it possible to shout conversations across it?